The price of pride. Anthony Collins had always been proud, and for most of his life, that pride had served him well. He had built a successful career, rising from a humble background to become the head of his own construction company. He was admired by his peers for his determination, respected by his employees for his strong leadership, and known in his community for his generosity. But there was one person who didn't hold Anthony in such high regard: his brother, Edward. Edward had always been the quieter of the two brothers, content with a modest life as a schoolteacher in their small town. While Anthony had focused on building his career, Edward had found happiness in simplicity: his small home, his books, and the garden he tended with care. The brothers had once been close, but as they grew older, their differences had created a distance between them. Anthony saw Edward's contentment as a lack of ambition, while Edward viewed Anthony's success as driven by ego rather than passion. Their strained relationship finally snapped one afternoon over a seemingly insignificant argument about their late parents' house. The house, a modest yet charming cottage on the outskirts of town, had been left to both brothers in their parents' will. Anthony had no interest in keeping the house. His own large home was more than enough. He suggested selling it and splitting the profits, but Edward refused. The cottage held too many memories for him, and he wanted to keep it as it was. "You're being sentimental," Anthony had said with frustration. "What's the point of holding on to a house that's falling apart?" "It's not just a house to me, Anthony," Edward replied, his voice firm but calm. "It's our home. It's where we grew up. I don't want to sell it." Anthony's pride flared. He saw Edward's refusal as another example of his brother's lack of practicality, his unwillingness to move forward. To Anthony, the house was just property, bricks and wood. He couldn't understand why Edward was so attached to it. "Fine," Anthony had said sharply. "You want the house, you can have it. But don't expect me to help pay for repairs when it starts falling apart." Edward had simply nodded, his face calm but his eyes filled with a sadness that Anthony didn't notice. After that day, the brothers had spoken only in passing, exchanging stiff pleasantries when they couldn't avoid each other at family gatherings. The house stood untouched for months, as neither brother wanted to deal with the uncomfortable situation. Then one day, Anthony received a call from his sister-in-law Sarah. Edward had fallen ill, a sudden heart condition that had left him weak and unable to work. Sarah explained that they were struggling financially, and the house was in desperate need of repairs. She asked Anthony if he could help. The moment Sarah asked for assistance, Anthony's pride took over. He remembered Edward's refusal to sell the house and how stubborn his brother had been. Now, he thought, Edward needed him. But instead of feeling compassion, Anthony felt a sense of superiority, as if this was his chance to prove that he had been right all along. "I told him that house would be more trouble than it was worth," Anthony said, his tone harsh. "Why should I help now when he didn't listen to me before?" Sarah was silent for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was steady but strained. "Because he's your brother, Anthony. He didn't ask for help because of his pride. But I'm asking now because we need it. Please, don't let pride come between you two." But Anthony's pride wouldn't let him forgive so easily. He ended the call, telling Sarah he'd think about it, though he already knew what his answer would be. The following weeks passed in a blur of meetings, deadlines, and projects. Anthony barely thought about Edward, convincing himself that his brother would manage somehow. But one night, while working late at his office, Anthony received another call, this time from the hospital. Edward had collapsed, his heart condition worsening. He had been rushed into surgery, but the prognosis wasn't good. Anthony sat in his office, the weight of the news pressing down on him. For the first time in years, he felt something crack within him, a small but significant shift. His brother, the one person who had always stood apart from the noise and ambition of his life, was now lying in a hospital bed, and there was nothing Anthony could do to fix it. He grabbed his coat and rushed to the hospital, his heart pounding with a mixture of guilt and fear. When he arrived, Sarah was sitting in the waiting room, her face pale and drawn. She looked up as Anthony approached, and the look in her eyes was one of both relief and resignation. "He's out of surgery," she said softly. "The doctors say it's touch and go. They don't know if he'll make it through the night." Anthony nodded, his throat tight. He felt as if he had swallowed a stone, the weight of it settling heavily in his chest. He wanted to say something, an apology, an admission of guilt, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he sat down next to Sarah and waited. Hours passed, and the silence between them grew heavy. Finally, a doctor emerged, his face tired but hopeful. "He's stable," the doctor said. It was close, but he made it through. Relief washed over Anthony, but it was quickly followed by a wave of shame. He had almost lost his brother. Over what? A house? An argument about property? His own stubborn pride? When Anthony was allowed to see Edward, he hesitated outside the hospital room, unsure of what to say or how to face the man lying in the bed. But when he entered, he found Edward awake, looking frail but alert. His eyes met Anthony's, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, it was Edward who broke the silence. "You came," he said, his voice weak but steady. Anthony swallowed hard, his pride crumbling in the face of his brother's vulnerability. "I'm sorry," he said, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "I'm sorry for everything, for the house, for not helping, for letting things get this far." Edward smiled faintly, his eyes softening. "We've both been stubborn, haven't we?" Anthony nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. For the first time in years, the tension between the two brothers eased. They talked quietly for a while, about their childhood, about their parents, about the house that had caused so much strife between them. As they spoke, Anthony realized that the house had never been the real issue. It was their pride, their unwillingness to bend, to forgive, to understand each other. In the end, it wasn't the house that mattered, but the bond they shared as brothers. As Anthony left the hospital that night, he felt lighter than he had in years. He knew that repairing his relationship with Edward would take time, but for the first time, he was willing to put aside his pride and make the effort. He had learned the hard way that pride could cost you the things that mattered most in life. And in the end, no success or material gain could ever replace the love and connection between family.
Thank you for listening. Like, subscribe, and share our channel Magic Mingle with your friends to enjoy more magical stories.